Good evening. I'm Chris Russell, and we're delighted to have you with us tonight for the Salisbury Forum. For those of you who are not familiar with the forum, we host nationally recognized speakers and free public forums. If you want to learn more about upcoming events, please go to our website or our homepage at www.salisburyforum.org and join our email list. You can also like us on Facebook. If you or your friends miss one of our talks, they're available on our website under videos. We're always happy to get your suggestions for topics and speakers. So please shoot us an email if you come across someone you think is an excellent speaker or a topic you think will be of interest to our audience. Our speaker, Sherry Turkle, has made a generous offer to give 100 copies of her new book, The Empathy Diaries, a memoir, to the first 100 people who have joined us for this webinar. The book is outstanding. I completely recommend it. I loved it. And it'd make a great Christmas gift as well, or holiday gift. There is a link to a Google form in the chat room. And click on that link to enter your name and mailing address, and we'll send you your free book. Your personal information will remain private and will only be shared with the publisher so that they will know where to ship your book. While our presentations have gone virtual, we still incur most of the costs of our in-person lectures. We rely on contributions from our audience to cover our operating expenses. We're very grateful for any contribution you've made and hope you'll consider one this year if you haven't already done so. We will have a Q&A period at the end of the talk, so click on the Q&A icon at the bottom center of your screen to type in any questions you may have. Please do not use the chat feature. So tonight we're joined by Sherry Turkle, and she is the Abby Rockefeller Moss Professor of the Social Studies of Science and Technology at MIT and the founding director of the MIT Initiative on Technology and Self. She's author of 6 books, including Alone Together, the New York Times bestseller, Reclaiming Conversation, and most recently, the Empathy Diaries, a Ms. Magazine Woman of the Year, TED speaker, featured media commentator. She's also a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Rockefeller Humanities Fellowship. Last but not least, Sherry is also a clinical psychologist. So Sherry, thank you for joining us. Please join.
My pleasure. Lovely to be here with you all.
So I have to say this quickly, just before we get started. I sent out the email blast to my colleagues today for the talk. And the first 2 responses, one of course was this is a first try at me for an interview. Of course, the first one was a video of an interview that had gone tremendously wrong, right? That had like completely bombed. But the second one was one from a colleague who I absolutely love and respect. And he just wrote, Sherry Turkle, wow, she's amazing. And yeah, we are really lucky to have you tonight. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So Sherry, just for some of the folks who may not be as familiar with your sort of the work you've done over your career, you've studied not only how computers change what we do, but sort of who we are, right? So for members of the audience who may be less familiar with your work, do you want to give us some context of some of the things you've done over the years? And it is expansive, so.
Yeah, it is. Well, basically, I think you really had it right. I got to MIT. I was a humanist at MIT. I came there for a year to write a book based on my dissertation, which was on French psychoanalysis. So you can see how far away I was from computers. And I met people who were thinking of their mind as machines. They would say things like, this was in 1976. So they would talk like, don't interrupt me, I need to clear my buffer, or I need to reprogram myself, to talk about doing psychotherapy. They said, you don't need to talk about Freudian slips. It was really information processing errors. I mean, it was amazing. The way in which people used artificial intelligence and computer language. It was just the beginning of the personal computer movement. And I saw that the metaphor of computing and relationships with computing were really going to affect how we thought about ourselves, our relationships with each other and our minds. And I was smitten. I was absolutely smitten with this new topic. And that was 1976. And I just said, I'm going to study this. And people really were not supportive. they said, you know, what's a nice psychologist like you studying such a, you know, a down market subject like, you know, computers and TRS-30s at Radio Shack and children and, you know, speak in spells. And I just thought that there was something there. And so really what I've done over decades is study the evolution of how digital culture has changed our minds. And so I've studied everything from, you know, how Tamagotchis, those little Tamagotchis changed, how kids thought what was alive and not alive, to to the beginning of AOL and then social media, to how Facebook has changed people's self-image and way of presenting their sense of who they are, and now it's threat to democracy. I mean, I've really studied everything about digital culture and its effect on the self, and now increasingly, I would say its attack on democracy, as social media does encroach on privacy and democracy. That's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it is. You know, one of the things that I was struck by, you know, sort of reading your work is just, one, how far ahead of the curve you were. It's incredible what you were doing in the 80s, and you know, is things that 30 years later people were just getting onto, right? I think is really amazing. You talk a little bit in your memoir about sort of transformative moments that, as a student, as a professional, when you think about sort of the digital world, right? And I know there are many, but are there certain moments that really stand out more than others that, you know, really, really changed, right? Like that sort of computers helping us, changing what we do, but to actually changing who we are.
Certainly. I mean, I think that for me, one of the key studies that I did that blew me away was when I saw the first children programming. And one of them said to me, when I program my computer, I put a little piece of my mind into the computer's mind, and I see myself differently. In other words, that was the title of my first book about computers, The Second Self. Mm-hmm. And I realized the intimacy of people's connection with this machine, that it wasn't just a tool, it really was an intimate connection. Another moment that was amazing was when I saw how personal robots, the first robots that could make eye contact, that could gesture towards you, that could track you and make eye contact as you moved across a room, how people were drawn into thinking that these objects were alive and sentient and cared for them, even though they knew that these objects did not care for them. And I think that that was a harbinger of what cheap dates we are when it comes to sort of seeing machines as not just artificial intelligences, but having artificial intimacy, and how ready we are to talk to machines and confide in machines, even when they don't deserve it. That was a moment in which I felt the deep vulnerability of people to what technologists could sell them. Another moment was when Facebook, after saying it would not take your private information, just went ahead with an algorithm that did take your private information. And it was clear to people in the business that the Facebook algorithm, scraped your data, kept you engaged by making you angry, because anger and often disinformation would keep you hooked and watching, and then kept you with people who were like you, because that would keep you angry and with people and siloed with people who agreed with you. And that was the formula for keeping you online longest. And it was really a moment when I realized how toxic that was going to be for democracy. Because in democracy, you need to not get angry, but be empathic and understand other people. And then you need to be with people who you disagree with, not just siloed with people you agree with. So those are just some examples of how, there really have been moments of kind of, I really would say revelation, when aspects of digital culture have kind of struck me as about to have tremendous import for the culture as a whole.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think you write in your book is and you wrote this as a sort of talking about when you were a student, but I think about it now in the world we live in commenting on some of the things that you've just mentioned, right, is that how we prepare ourselves to see the world determines the world we see.
Yes.
And do you, like, in that sense, do you think that is still the case, or even more so, I guess?
Oh, yes. Yes. I think that, I just want to say triple times yes. I mean, I think that, if you, and here's where there was a wonderful book many years ago by Nicholas Carr that took off from an article about is Google making us dumb, or is Google making us stupid? And he called the book The Shallows. And it's still widely read. It's still a classic. And what he meant by the shallows was that we think we're reading everything. We're reading online all the time. We're sampling we're always doing our hyperlinks. We're constantly looking and looking and looking on our phones. We're clicking and clicking, but we're not necessarily doing the kind of deep reading that gives us many points of view and a deep understanding of things. We kind of know a lot. We know a lot of little factlets, but we're not necessarily doing the thinking, the deep thinking, learning how to think about problems. And I think that this is perhaps one of the, even though his book was a bestseller, and that this what I'm saying now is no longer sounds new or like news. People really have to keep thinking about this, because we really need to keep learning how to think, because you can see in our politics, you can see in our conversation that we're forgetting how to think deeply. We're forgetting how important it is in a democracy to think about many points of view, to keep clear what it is that makes a democracy, to keep clear how important empathy and being able to get into the experience of other people and understand their experience, how crucial that is for a democratic process. We're not thinking deeply about these things. We're talking in slogans. I'll cancel you. I'll cancel you. What is that? Will cancel you? I mean, even in my classes, people are often afraid to speak because they want to be sure they're being correct. It's really not a time to be correct. It's a time to listen deeply to each other. And I think that digital culture has not helped with that. So yes, I think that the tools that we learn from digital culture are not necessarily the ones we need now.
Want to talk?
Even, let me just add one more thing. Even
Yep.
email, when somebody, when you get an email or you get a text, the point is to respond to it. And I often tell my students, or when I consult, that the power move is to respond, I'm thinking. And people say, you can't do that. And I say, try it. It's like, just send an email that says, I'm thinking about that. And, watch the organization get upset. And it signals that somebody asked you a question and you would actually like to think. You would actually like to give this a little think. And people are shocked if you're not, there with an answer. When we have to go back to some older habits of thinking, not responding.
Yeah, I think the power of reflection, right, is maybe not nearly
Right.
appreciated as it used to be, or at least not as much as it used to be.
Yeah.
I think that's certainly the case. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of just the title, The Empathy Diaries, but also the title of the conversation, right? How to be human in a digital world. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like what's the step for parents out there, for educators, for people who like me who don't like the noise?
Right.
What are the best steps forward to being more human?
Well, the first step is to recultivate solitude, because solitude is the thing that digital culture erodes first. And solitude, because we have slots for iPads in baby bouncers. We have slots for iPads in potty trainers. The idea that there always is a sort of incoming, that there's always stimulation. And from babyhood, you literally are never sort of alone with your thoughts. That's just become like okay for people. That at the dinner table, there's never just kind of quiet and then conversation and reflection. And the reason that I stress solitude as a place to start, demanding that you relearn solitude for yourself if you've forgotten it, but also teaching your children the importance of solitude, because you teach solitude to a child by letting them be alone with you. It's solitude. You don't sort of throw a child alone. You keep a child company in a quiet place, and then gradually you sort of remove your hand and you just are alone with them. You're alone together. And they realize the power of just quietness. And the reason that's so important is that solitude is where empathy is born. Is that if you don't know who you are, you can't come to somebody else and say, who are you? You come to somebody else and you want to sort of use them to tell you who you are, to buttress your fragile self. And there's a great, in the psychoanalytic tradition, there's a great analyst named Winnicott who said, if you don't teach your children to be alone, they'll only know how to be lonely. And it's a beautiful thought that in order to really have mutuality, you have to be able to have solitude. And the erosion of empathy, the assault on empathy that I write about in Claiming Conversation and in the Empathy Diaries, really begins with this assault on solitude. So the first step for parents, for anyone who's listening, for don't have to be a parent, you just need to be a person, is to buttress your capacity for solitude. And boredom is a very important thing, because when you're experiencing boredom, your brain is not bored. Your brain is laying down what's called the default mode network, which is a technical way of saying that the parts of the associations of neurons that really make up your sense of a historical self. You can't do without that. But you need that quiet time. You need that quiet time in order to be able to do that. So you need to have those periods of downtime and boredom and quietness so that your brain can do that. If the minute you feel bored, you pull out a phone, you're not giving your brain the time to do that. So I say, no devices at dinner, no devices in the bedroom, no devices in the kitchen, anything that has to do with food or bedtime, it's not a device time. No devices in the car. That's a time for conversation. And that's very hard for parents because, you know, their kids are saying, no, this is my social media time on the drive to school. And a parent just needs to be able to say, it's very important for our family to talk to each other. I'm driving, I'm not on my phone. This is our time to talk. So a little bit what's needed. And again, this is a very big part of I feel that my professional life as, you know, somebody who's really studied this, is to tell parents, step up and make the kitchen, the dining room table, and the car your sacred spaces. Even parents don't like it at first, but I think it's very important. And I think it makes more sense to me. You know, some people say keep Saturday or keep a Sabbath without phones. You know, if people find that's helpful, that's great. But I think that it's also very powerful. And I think it's in some ways it's more effective for people to realize that the dinner table is a place for conversation and empathy in the family. The car is a place where family talks, and the bedroom is a place where people sleep. Children are getting less and less sleep because they're on their phones all night. So that's a pretty comprehensive set of things to do to kind of reclaim your boundaries while you're living in digital culture. I mean, I'm not saying throw away your devices. We all live in digital culture, but we can also reclaim ourselves.
The comment about boredom, right? And I've heard colleagues say like, wow, kids are, like, they don't know how to be bored anymore. And I think about my son when we say, you know, turn the computer off, and the first thing he does is hit the ground and say, I'm bored. I think that's
right. But you have to be able to say to a child, I think part of what is important for parents is that it helps if the parent can say to the child, look, I know you're bored and I'm glad for it. See, I think that that's where a little bit of information helps parents, because when a child says they're bored, the parent has to say, that's good. I'm not just, oh, well, here's something else to do, or read a book, or here's something better to do than the phone. Here's a puzzle, or it's okay. And actually, one of the things about puzzles and other kinds of, quiet activities is that it sort of calms you down and allows you to be bored and helps you kind of tolerate boredom. So walking and running and swimming and exercising are ways to yoga, ways in which people can get into boredom in a way that they can tolerate better. Music, repetitive things are a way to, be bored without being crazy. But a parent has to be able to say, oh, you're bored, good. And here's why. Not, oh, you're bored, what can we do about it? I'm sorry I made you bored,
I want to ask a little bit about, and this comes up in your book at times, and it's not only in relation to empathy, but also you talk about with technology as well. And that is sort of the role or the relationship of vulnerability. And can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, vulnerability is the thing that technology promises it will get rid of. So if you can text, not talk. When I interview people and I say, I'm thinking of one of my most interesting interviews. I was talking to a young man who tells me his whole life is on text. I mean, he loves to, I mean, that's the way he likes to communicate. And I said, what about conversation? Because I was having a conversation with him, you know, and he was pretty good at conversation. I said, what about conversation? He said, oh, conversation, I hate conversation. So I didn't bring up that we were having one. I thought that would be like not cool. But I said, well, what's wrong with conversation? He says, I'll tell you what's wrong with conversation. It takes place in real time, and you never know what the other person is going to say. In other words, you have to respond. You have to, they could ask you something, and you are vulnerable to what they ask you. And it was so moving because it was such a concise statement of what technology promises it will deliver us from. It will deliver us from that sense of vulnerability that we're going to be on the spot and have to show who we are. And if I text, if I email, I can compose myself. I can be, I don't know, I can be Sherry Turkle, eloquent, wise. I don't know. I mean, you know, you have me here on Zoom. My throat is scratchy. Maybe I'm not being as eloquent as I want to be. You know, it's a different experience, but I'm okay with it. And in a way, you get to see, I mean, you get to know me better, and I'm really okay with that. But that's what's wrong with conversation, and that's what technology promises to deliver us from, our vulnerability, and to bring us to a world. And this is another thing that comes up so much in my interviews, that is somehow friction-free. You know, that in a family, you know, I think of my family dinners as a child. I mean, people really got into it. There was a lot of conflict. And technology promises that you can have, you know, people tell me they like to have their family fights. They like to have their family discussions on GChat, you know, on some kind of mediated conversation, because it will be friction-free. It will not have this vulnerability. And my students would prefer to meet and have their conferences electronically in a chat situation rather than see me. And I say, why? I mean, I want to say, people pay to see me. Why don't you want to see me? And they say, because I will ask you my perfect question, and you can give me your perfect answer. And so again, it's that they don't have to be vulnerable to showing, you know, that they don't have it exactly pulled together, you know, that they can compose themselves, and that theoretically I will compose myself. And what's missing there, I mean, just to sum this up, what's missing there is what learning is not asking a perfect question. It's coming to a teacher with a poor question and having the teacher say, well, that's not a great question, but come back again and we'll look at it together again, together, again. Those are the magic words for mentorship. Together again, together again. It's not that it's perfect, or it's not that it's seamless. It's mentorship is about together again. And the vulnerability of showing your poor work and having somebody guide you together again toward your better self. And people are really afraid of that and want technology to smooth that out. And technology does smooth that out. And we're taking that opportunity more and more and more. People want to talk to robot psychotherapists. I'm doing a whole study on how people want to talk to robot psychotherapists. I mean, that's not a very vulnerable situation to tell your troubles to a robot. So.
I mean, I've always found in the community that I'm in that with our chapel, where kids show their vulnerability, that's it's been maybe the greatest community builder for us. I think it's a really powerful thing, and that it's okay to be uncomfortable.
Right. But that's a lesson. You can only learn that lesson if you're surrounded by people in a community with trust. And when I can get my students to come to office hours and trust me and know that I'm there for them, I'm committed to them. Empathy is really, in the Empathy Diaries, I write so much about empathy. I'm writing more about empathy now. It's a superpower in business, the superpower in education. But you can't get to it unless you make a commitment to somebody. It's not just, oh, kumbaya, you're divorced, I'm divorced, I know what divorce is, I know how you're feeling. I mean, it's making a commitment to really hearing someone out and being there for them. So I'm good for you and good for your school that you have a chapel environment where people are willing to do that.
So wanted to ask you a little bit about, and we talked briefly before this, about what's the next step with empathy, and what's the next project?
Right. Well, I mean, the memoir that, I'm so happy to share with you, and that I'm very excited that so many of you will get to read. I was very excited to be able to share the book with people who signed up. The point of it was not to tell the story of my life, but to show the connection between my life, my personal life, and the development of my work, and how empathy was such a powerful driver for not just my intellectual work, but for my life. I mean, and empathy being, that you begin with radical humility, and you don't say, oh, I know how you feel, but you say, I don't know how you feel. And you are there to listen and commit to really understanding. And in my own life, I came to that, out of a situation where I didn't understand why the people in my life were not letting me see my father or use my father's name. It was like a mystery. And I became sort of the Nancy Drew of my life to try to figure out why these adults who loved me would do such a thing. They wouldn't even talk about it. So I wanted to write a book that showed how trying to understand other people, even as a child, drove this passionate connection to the question of empathy. But my goal was not like to write the whole story of my life. So I'm not going to continue to work on empathy by writing more about my life. What I am going to try to do next is to really drill down, I think, on the limits of empathy. Because what does it mean to have empathy? So I'm not taking away how important empathy is, or the power of empathy, or how much we need empathy now. I want to explore, for example, the relationship of empathy and democracy much more fully. The fact that, I think that empathy, President Biden said on Memorial Day that empathy is the fuel for democracy. And what he meant was, if you can't listen to someone else, if you're not willing to hear someone else, you're not willing to give them the vote. It kind of, one thing leads to another, that, you have to, first be willing to hear someone in a democracy and acknowledge that they're a human being, citizen, understand their situation, and that we can have, we can talk across difference. And that I want to explore more the potential of empathy, but also its limitations. Because as you and I were talking before we began, what about if you're empathic with someone and they don't believe in vaccination because they don't believe in science, or they don't believe in giving everybody the vote because they don't think everybody's created equal. That's just something that people say but don't have to believe. What about if they think that this country really isn't for everybody? When you really get to be empathic with them, they don't believe this country is for everybody, it's only for certain people. And you get empathic with them and you discover that fundamentally you can't be in a community with them. What is the next step in a democracy? Where, when empathy is so crucial as a first step, what is the boundary between empathy and a politics where you say, well, we're done talking, now we need to move to something else. I think that boundary between empathy and a recognition that you don't share common cause and cannot share common cause after empathy. How do you make that decision that you cannot convince someone? What are the limits of trying to convince and the limits of persuasion? I'm very interested in exploring the psychology of that, politics of that.
I can't wait to read about it.
Well, I think it's a tough assignment.
Yeah, it is.
Everybody who's listening, everybody who's listening should, write in there. But I'm also interested in the power of empathy, and I'm interested in, since it was so important in my life, I'm interested in how it really works in creativity and politics and art and talking to people about moments in their practice when empathy really was the driver for their best moments, and also when empathy wasn't enough. So that's what I want to get at, a way of interviewing people and of talking to people about when was empathy the driver and when was empathy not enough. So that's how I kind of am shaping my next project.
So I've got one more question before we turn to the audience, and just a reminder, if folks have questions, please put them in the Q&A button down below, and we'll take some. But in the wake of sort of the Facebook revelations and things like that, what's the next step for people? Like, as individuals, you talk about, here's some things you can do with your kids and with your families. What's the next step as
Facebook?
Yeah,
filled with ideas. I just wrote it. Sorry.
I mentioned
What's
the other day.
question?
I mentioned do we need like the Facebook version of like Occupy Wall Street? What's next?
Well, I mean, I think that I last week I had an editorial in the Wall Street Journal. There was a bunch of people who were asked to answer the question, what's next for Facebook? And they asked me, and I one of the things I said, I'm trying to recall, it was a great line. It was, just because we grew up with the internet, we think the internet is all grown up. Yeah. And I love that line. Writers are so vain, they fall in love with things they wrote. But the reason I really like that line is that is the fallacy of the way we approach technology. That digital technology still feels new, even to kids who've grown up with it. It still feels new. You know, they've had it all their life, but it still feels, you know, I'm sorry, digital technology, it feels like it's been there forever. That's what I was trying, it's the opposite I was trying to say. It still feels like social media, people use phrases to me like the horse is out of the barn. You know, it's like what it is what it is. It's like, you know, and it's because we grew up with it. It's because it seems so mature. It seems so fancy. It seems so, it's like, it's what is there. It's what we've been given. But in fact, in the scale of how long digital technology, it's kind of like saying that after 30 years of the automobile, that's it. That's it. That was the end. That was the car. Whatever there was 30 years after 30 years after the Model T, that was the car. No, the car is evolving, you know, and seat belts and windshield wipers and, you know, heated seats and all kinds of safety things. I have a car now that tells me how to park. It tells me how not to kill people. It tells me who's behind me. I'm looking at a movie of what's behind me. I mean, it's amazing, this car. I just wish I could have this car like walking around with me all the time. I mean, the point being that now it's time to make social media into something that helps us. Facebook, the way Facebook was built, get us mad and keep us with our own kind, is the most anti-empathic machine. It's the anti-empathy machine. And also scrape our data so you can sell who we are to anybody, and we have no control over that. Our privacy, where we go, what we do, who we see, what we write, all of that to be sold. And it doesn't belong to us, and we don't even know where it is. I mean, all of this was done because we weren't paying attention, because we were so excited that we were getting free email and we could post our baby pictures. I mean, we were not paying attention to this new technology. And little things that happened, and people said, you know, because I was studying this as it was happening, and I remember we would, you know, people who were in the business would say, excuse me, you know, people are selling your data, and people would say, oh, who cares? You know, I like getting ads for things I like. And you couldn't get people to have a more engaged conversation than that. I mean, I remember talking to very sophisticated MIT students who knew what that meant. And I said, well, they're selling your data. Well, I kind of like getting ads for things I like, would be the response. It sort of helps me to get ads for things I like. And now we see that the relationship between intimacy, privacy, and democracy, those three things really go together. That you need intimacy, privacy, and democracy. They go together. So what's next for Facebook is getting social media regulated, and not allowing it to be, because it is so essential to the constitution of people's selves and the constitution of our political system. You can't have elections where that can be manipulated by Facebook telling certain people that their friends have voted and other people that their friend, you know, and getting, you know, this refers to a study that Facebook did where they took a sample of people and they told them that your friends have voted. Why haven't you voted? And those people went and voted from the peer pressure of their friends voting. But you can target who you tell to vote that way. You can target how you manipulate people in such fine ways. And, you know, you can't have a company with that kind of with that kind of reach and that kind of data, able to, manipulate the political system the way it does. So anyway, and certainly, I mean, just to finish this rant, certainly it's a media company and needs to be treated as a media company. You just can't print, kind of whatever, any kind of falsehood, any kind of whatever, and just say, well, whatever. We're not a media company. We're just kind of a bulletin board at a Stop and Shop, and anybody can put up anything.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, those are just some of the things that, but basically it's a very, very, it's very, very powerful. And the language of consumer protect, the language of monopolies is not the right language to be talking about the problem. Like, it's too big, we need to make it littler. That's not sufficient to the problem. So that's just some of the things that I think about Facebook.
Yeah. So let's turn to a couple of questions. There's a few questions in the Q&A. So this is coming back to empathy from Andy. He writes, "Come to believe that empathy without action is hollow." Could you comment on that?
Well, that's what I was kind of saying, is that for me, I begin with an expanded definition of empathy to begin with, which is not, I know how you feel, but I don't know how you feel. It's humility and commitment, and then being there for the person. And being there for the person means, really being there for what that person needs to do in order to, act in a way that's going to help them. So I don't know what you mean about empathy without action, but I mean, in terms of, I mean a commitment to the person for action. So I mean, my notion of empathy agrees with you.
A little bit of a follow-up, and this comes to sort of what you were finishing with empathy. Don't we need to cross a boundary with them? And I think that, meaning some of those folks, that it's, as you were talking about, where does it stop? Like what are its limits? Do you feel like do you have to cross a boundary with those folks? Well,
I mean, people have boundaries, and I'm not suggesting we just go out there into a kind of a sense of, you can't have empathy with everyone. You can have compassion. I mean, empathy and compassion are not the same thing. Compassion is something different than empathy. Compassion is, I can feel compassion for people who I read about, who are refugees, who are, in situations that I can, read about and understand and have a sense of. But empathy is kind of something different. Empathy is a much more active, participant, conversational. So I think it's important to sort of get a little bit clear on the terms. Empathy is really getting to know someone in a way where there is not a blurring of the boundaries between you and the person, but a kind of crossing of the boundaries so that you're in a position to be helpful. But I think what I was trying to raise at the end is the place where you put up a boundary and you say, I can't go further with you here. I've understood something that makes me need to pull back and go to something else. And that's what I'm struggling with now, and accepting comments to write me directly. So, when does empathy, what are the limits of empathy? That's a question to my audience. I'm sorry, I'm sorry you're not all zooming around me.
So here's another from Robert. He asks, how much does disinformation and misinformation set the limits of empathy?
I think it's a different problem. Disinformation and misinformation on social media, you can target it, it's to be targeted and ferreted out. I mean, you can't have empathy. One of the issues that I was talking about at Chris before the program began is, can you have empathy with someone who doesn't believe in truth as a basic value? And together we kind of came up with not so much. And I think what we face as a country is that there are limits to the amount of empathy you can have with people who don't care about truth as a value. Because then you say, okay, well, I'm empathic with you and you don't care about who won the election. You just want to say, I want to put an X anyway. I'm empathic, but I can't commit to you. Or, we're going to have a problem here. That's where politics begins. I've understood something, but now you and I have a real difference. Or if I'm empathic with you and I see you've gotten your information about COVID being a plot from Russian hackers, sort of, and you don't want to call into question the source of that information and why they might be putting that out. And you don't want to act on COVID because you think it's a plot, or Bill Gates is putting it in is putting in chips in the food. I mean, there's at some point a certain kind of disinformation when you find out through empathy that somebody has been infected by disinformation, that your empathy with them, you're getting into their problem. You then need to move to not just kind of continuing a kind of relational thing, but saying, hold on a second, we need to now have a different kind of conversation. As a teacher, I can be empathic with my students, but if my students are bullying another student, I need to put a stop to it. So I think as teachers all the time, I can be empathic, but I also have to say, okay, no, this is, now you can't do that anymore. So I hope that helps.
Yeah.
Empathy isn't carte blanche to be nice to everybody or like everybody or accept mistruths or accept disinformation, or, that's not the point. It doesn't end your critical facilities. It doesn't, but at least it helps you understand what you're dealing with. I mean, I want to understand why people are drawn to believing that Bill Gates is putting chips in their blood or their food. I mean, that I need to understand why that's a thing. Why would people be drawn to that? I'm very interested in understanding why. I don't want to just say, oh, they're idiots. I really want to understand why people are drawn to those ideas. I consider that my civic duty, and I think my empathy is going to help me.
So this is from Josephine. It's a little bit longer, so give me a. It says, thank you for sharing your insights. We seem to be living in a time of radical loss of empathy, is in our loss of connection to each other, but also to our larger world, our planetary habitat. It seems we don't have time in terms of species survival to rely only on educating the young towards radical empathy and meta-kindness. Can technology play a role in helping us to accelerate healing for the radical breaks in empathy in our world today?
This is such a great question. I hope so. I truly hope so. There are so many proposals for using technology as an accelerator, and I'm excited by all of them. What I think is the things that I find most interesting are when technology is used as a kind of catalyst for bringing people together face to face. I always think that in building communities, the role of technology is to get those people to come together face to face. And I think that, to begin conversations online and then get those people together. I think, where technology can help is in beginning conversations and then somehow having those conversations continue, and then hopefully getting those people together to act in concert as groups, and hopefully face to face, but maybe not always face to face, but getting people who have common cause to come together to, I think, my last book was called Reclaiming Conversation. And I talked about conversation as the talking cure for the isolation that we're facing now. And part of that isolation is that we've given up so many of the face-to-face communities, the churches, the synagogue groups, the garden clubs, the Rotary clubs, that used to dot America, that used to sustain Thursday night, Wednesday night, Friday night. I mean, there just was a lot of activity. The book clubs, the face-to-face meetings, and that people don't seem to have time for anymore. And I think that people have gotten used to the ideas of, well, we'll just do it on Zoom. But if we could use technology to bring back those conversations and facilitate people getting together face to face, I would be very excited by that. I don't think technological conversations alone are enough. That's my private, because that the bonds people form when they just meet online are not quite the same, are just not the same. Once you've met together and then you take it off, online, you can sustain some of the energy. But I think it's very important to meet together.
Thank you. I just want to say, we started with the email I got from my friend who said, you know what, Sherry Turkle, she's amazing. And you did not disappoint. Sherry, thank you so much. Is there anything you want to sort of close with? I think that, our evening.
Yeah, I want to just say again, although I said it was my favorite sentence that I've written in this month, and I said it 3 times, just because we grew up with the internet is not all grown up, but we have to act and make social media better for us and our children. The technology is there for us to make and shape. I've lived a lifetime at MIT among technologists who I think that they make technology and then it's our job to consume it. We need a consumer movement. We need a politicized consumer movement to make technology serve human values, because there's nothing about the building of technology that makes it serve human values unless the people who it's designed for really speak up and say, well, that isn't serving my human values. And a technology that you're on every day, the social media that you're on every day, it is designed to keep you on it by making you mad and then keeping you mad with people who you agree with. So that's not good. That's my closing argument.
Well, thank you so much for your time this Friday evening. Just a reminder to folks, the book is Sherry has offered it to folks for free. If you can just please enter your address into the chat, that would be awesome. And we will, the publishers will get those books out to you. It's also available at Oblong Books. And like I said, I love the book. Thank you so much for sharing. And I hope folks have a wonderful evening and safe holidays.
Good night.
Good night.